The Industrial Revolution was one of the most significant transitions in human history. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading across Europe, North America, and eventually the globe, industrialization introduced new methods of production, altered patterns of labor, and transformed the structure and scale of urban life. Prior to industrialization, most economies were primarily agrarian. The majority of people lived in rural areas and worked in subsistence or small-scale farming, or in domestic industries such as textile spinning and weaving carried out within homes. Production was decentralized and tools were typically hand-powered. Trade existed, but it was limited in volume compared to what would follow. Social structures were often based on land ownership, hereditary status, and small community networks. The advent of industrialization introduced mechanical power, initially through water and later steam, as a primary driver of production. One of the earliest and most influential inventions was James Watt's improved steam engine in the 1770s. This innovation enabled factories to be located away from rivers and operate with greater power and efficiency. Machines such as the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom revolutionized textile production, which became one of the first fully industrialized sectors. With these changes, production began to concentrate in large buildings where labor was organized under one roof. This shift to centralized factory work was a foundational change in how goods were produced. Increased output, along with innovations in metallurgy, transportation, including railways and steamships, and communication, such as the telegraph, accelerated economic expansion and global trade. Population growth also played a role. Improvements in agriculture during the 18th century, often termed the Agricultural Revolution, reduced food scarcity, which in turn contributed to a growing labor force. As demand for factory workers increased, people migrated in large numbers from rural areas to urban centers. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds in Britain, and later Chicago and Pittsburgh in the United States, expanded rapidly. Industrialization brought about technological, economic, and social changes. Urban centers became densely populated, and new social categories emerged based on occupational roles, particularly in industrial settings. The effects of these changes would be far-reaching, influencing every aspect of life in the 19th and 20th centuries. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the rapid growth of industrial cities. These new urban centers became the focal points of economic activity, labor, and population. It was a shift from rural agrarian society toward a modern, urbanized world. In the pre-industrial era, most people lived in rural villages and towns with populations rarely exceeding a few thousand. Urban life did exist, particularly in capitals, port cities, and market centers, but it was limited in scale. As factories were built in and around existing towns, these areas quickly expanded into major cities. The pull of steady wages drew rural populations toward urban centers, creating rapid population growth in a relatively short time. Manchester, often cited as the first industrial city, provides a clear example. In 1750, it had a population of roughly 25,000. By 1851, this number had grown to over 300,000. Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, and Glasgow experienced similar expansions. Across Britain, the percentage of people living in urban areas rose from around 20% in the late 18th century to over 50% by the mid-19th century. The same patterns would later be seen in parts of the United States, France, Germany, and beyond. This migration was not confined to national borders. The industrial economy also drew in foreign labor. Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine arrived in large numbers in English and American cities, while workers from rural Eastern Europe migrated to the industrial zones of Germany and Austria-Hungary later in the century. The growth of industrial cities was largely unplanned. Factory owners and speculative developers constructed housing rapidly and cheaply to accommodate the expanding labor force. In most cases, there was little oversight from local authorities. As a result, densely packed rows of brick terraced houses or tenement buildings sprang up with minimal attention to sanitation, ventilation, or safety. Living conditions were often dire. Multiple families might share a single dwelling, sometimes even a single room. Access to clean water was limited, and sewer systems were either inadequate or non-existent. Waste disposal was haphazard, leading to polluted streets and water sources. These conditions made industrial cities particularly vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Cholera epidemics in the 1830s and 1840s, for example, spread rapidly through urban populations, prompting some of the first public health reforms. At the same time, urban infrastructure such as roads, canals, and later railways developed to support industrial growth. These transportation networks connected cities with raw materials, labor markets, and export routes. The growth of rail in particular was transformative, both for moving goods and for enabling commuting and migration. Industrial cities introduced a new kind of spatial and social organization. Proximity to factories was a necessity for workers, so residential areas often clustered near industrial zones. These neighborhoods were characterized by pollution, noise, and congestion. In contrast, wealthier industrialists and middle-class professionals moved further out, establishing suburban enclaves with cleaner air, more space, and better amenities. Initially, many industrial cities lacked effective governance. Rapid growth outpaced traditional institutions, and local authorities struggled to manage urban problems. However, by the mid-19th century, urban reform became a central concern. Public health legislation, building codes, and early zoning laws began to appear in response to epidemics, fires, and public outcry over living conditions. In Britain, the Public Health Act of 1848 gave local governments the authority to improve sanitation and regulate housing. Similar efforts occurred in France under Baron Haussmann's redesign of Paris in the 1850s, and in American cities through the work of urban reformers and sanitary commissions. Before industrialization, much of manufacturing occurred within or near the home. Artisans produced goods using hand tools, often as part of the so-called putting out or domestic system. Merchants supplied raw materials to workers, who completed tasks in stages, spinning, weaving, dyeing, before the final product was collected. Work was largely self-directed, seasonal, and shaped by the rhythms of agriculture and community life. The factory system replaced this decentralized production model with centralized mechanized manufacturing. Instead of working at home, laborers came to a single location, often large, purpose-built buildings, to perform specific tasks under a strict schedule. This concentration of labor allowed for greater control, supervision, and output. It also meant a redefinition of time, discipline, and autonomy in the workplace. The heart of the factory system was machinery. In textile production, devices such as the spinning jenny, the water frame, and later the power loom dramatically increased output while reducing the need for skilled manual labor. Tasks that had once required years of apprenticeship could now be performed by relatively untrained workers with the help of machines. This led to a process of labor specialization. Workers were assigned narrow, repetitive tasks designed to maximize efficiency and output. The division of labor, most famously analyzed by Adam Smith, was applied on a scale never seen before. Factory work introduced a new form of labor discipline. In contrast to the flexible schedules of pre-industrial labor, factories operated according to rigid timetables. Time became a commodity. Bells or whistles signaled the start and end of shifts. Breaks were regulated, and lateness or absence could result in fines or dismissal. Workers were expected to adapt to the pace of machines, not the other way around. Working conditions were often harsh. Factories were hot, noisy, and poorly ventilated. Accidents were common, especially in textile mills and metal foundries. There were few safety standards, and protective equipment was rare. Hours were long, commonly 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 days a week. These conditions were especially difficult for children and women, who made up a significant portion of the early industrial workforce. The transformation of labor prompted various forms of resistance. In the early 19th century, groups like the Luddites protested against the introduction of machines that threatened traditional jobs. Their actions, such as breaking into factories and destroying equipment, were driven less by opposition to technology itself and more by fears of job loss, wage reductions, and worsening conditions. Over time, more organized forms of labor resistance began to emerge. Friendly societies, trade unions, and mutual aid organizations developed to protect workers' interests. Although early unions were often illegal and faced strong opposition from employers and the state, they laid the foundation for later labor movements and collective bargaining. Social reformers, including figures like Robert Owen and Florence Nightingale, tried to improve health, housing, and education. Religious groups and philanthropists supported charitable work. Governments, responding to public pressure, introduced labor laws, factory inspections, and public health measures. Industrialization also inspired political ideologies and movements. Socialism and communism developed in response to perceived injustices in capitalist industrial society. Thinkers such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels analyzed class struggle as a central dynamic of history. As industrial economies developed, so did new social distinctions rooted in the organization of labor and ownership. The most significant of these was the emergence of a distinct working class, those who sold their labor for wages in industrial settings. Unlike peasants who had ties to land or artisans who controlled their tools and output, industrial workers were dependent on employers, and their relationship to work was defined by wage contracts. This group, often referred to as the proletariat in later theoretical literature, occupied the lower end of the economic hierarchy. Their economic position was marked by insecurity, long hours, and limited upward mobility. Families often relied on the combined wages of all members, including women and children, to survive. Above them was a growing middle class, composed of factory owners, merchants, managers, and professionals. This group benefited most from industrial growth, accumulating capital, investing in production and enjoying the comforts of urban prosperity. Their values, self-discipline, thrift, education, and domestic stability, became dominant cultural ideals in industrial societies. Traditional aristocracies, especially in Western Europe, were challenged but not displaced. In many cases, landowning elites adapted by investing in industry or infrastructure, maintaining influence even as new wealth rose. The resulting class structure was more fluid than the rigid hierarchies of feudalism, but also more dependent on economic conditions. Economic recessions, mechanization, and shifts in global trade could rapidly displace workers and increase poverty in industrial cities. The wealth generated by industrial production was distributed unevenly, but this inequality took on new characteristics. Unlike the traditional lord-peasant relationship tied to land, the factory owner-wage-labor dynamic created different forms of dependency and insecurity. Workers became reliant on wages rather than agricultural cycles or craft skills, facing new vulnerabilities such as unemployment during economic downturns and workplace accidents. Factory owners and investors accumulated capital while the majority of laborers worked long hours for low wages. Industrial cities concentrated large numbers of workers in close proximity, making economic disparities more visible and politically charged than the scattered poverty of rural areas. These transformed inequalities intersected with political exclusion that, while rooted in pre-industrial traditions, became increasingly contentious in the new context. In early industrial societies, political power remained concentrated among landowners and established elites. Most working-class men, and all women, were excluded from voting in public office. In Britain, for example, only a small percentage of adult males could vote prior to the Reform Acts of the 19th century. In other countries, comparable tensions arose. Revolutionary uprisings in 1848 across Europe were fueled in part by frustrations over these inequalities and continued political exclusion. Industrialization thus contributed to new forms of political consciousness, linking economic roles to social identity and sparking movements that would gradually influence the development of labor laws, political parties, and mass democracy. While industrialization began in Britain, it soon spread to other parts of Europe and North America, followed later by regions in Asia and Latin America. The process unfolded unevenly, determined by local resources, political institutions, and global economic relationships. In continental Europe, countries like Belgium, France, and Germany industrialized by the mid-19th century. Germany's later unification in 1871 enabled more coordinated national development, and by the end of the century, it had become a major industrial power, particularly in steel, coal, and chemicals. France's industrial growth was slower and more regionally uneven, combining mechanized factories with traditional small-scale industries. The United States industrialized rapidly after the Civil War, aided by abundant natural resources, immigration, and large internal markets. Railroads played a central role in integrating distant regions and facilitating mass production. Cities such as Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit became industrial hubs. In Japan, industrialization was initiated deliberately by the Meiji government following 1868. The state actively promoted infrastructure, education, and technology transfer to modernize the economy and reduce dependence on Western powers. Elsewhere, many regions remained suppliers of raw materials to industrial powers. Colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were often integrated into the global industrial economy as sources of cotton, rubber, minerals, and foodstuffs. While some infrastructure and export-oriented industries developed in these regions, full-scale industrialization was limited. The growth of industrial cities transformed culture and daily life. New forms of leisure, consumption, education, and public space arose in response to the urban industrial environment. For the working class, leisure time was limited but valued. Pubs, music halls, and sports became key elements of working-class culture in Britain and elsewhere. Horse racing, boxing, and football attracted mass audiences. In the United States, vaudeville theaters and baseball became popular. These venues offered distraction, entertainment, and a sense of community in densely populated urban neighborhoods. Middle-class urban culture emphasized respectability, order, and domestic life. The Victorian home, centered around the family and shaped by ideas of gender roles, became a cultural ideal. Reading, concerts, and museums reflected values of self-improvement and refinement. Public libraries, parks, and schools were often promoted by reformers as tools for moral and civic education. Literacy rates rose during the 19th century, driven by education reforms and the growth of mass printing. Newspapers and serialized novels reached broad audiences, shaping public opinion and popular tastes. Writers such as Charles Dickens in Britain and Émile Zola in France used fiction to depict the social consequences of industrialization. Urban space itself became increasingly organized. Boulevards, street lighting, public transport, and sanitation systems were introduced, especially in the second half of the century. In Paris, the redesign of the city under Baron Haussmann tried to modernize, enrich, and control urban life. Similar initiatives took place in Vienna, Berlin, and New York. In sum, Industrialization gave rise to complex urban cultures, made by both economic conditions and evolving social ideals. Cities became sites of both innovation and conflict, spaces where class, culture, and technology intersected in new ways. By the early 20th century, the legacy of industrialization was well established. It had created enormous productive capacity and technological progress, but it had also exposed new vulnerabilities. In the end, the city, the machine, and the class became central features of the modern world.